Cole, hand me your radio and step away from the scene right now. Sergeant, there are girls inside that building!
You disobeyed direct orders. Turn off that body camera now!
No, sir, I will not do that!
Officer Dylan Reed was only 24 years old and had been on the force for 8 months. Most officers called him soft because he still believed police officers were supposed to protect people first. While other rookies tried to impress supervisors, Dylan spent his time helping stranded drivers, calming scared victims, and checking on homeless people during cold nights. Some officers respected him quietly, but most laughed behind his back. Around the station, they said he cared too much to survive in real police work. The department had a bad reputation for how it handled missing teen cases. Supervisors cared more about numbers than people. If a teenager disappeared, officers were pushed to label it a runaway as fast as possible. It kept paperwork low and made crime reports look better. Any officer who asked too many questions quickly became a problem. Dylan had already been warned twice for wasting time on cases supervisors wanted closed. Just after midnight, dispatch received a call about a young African-American girl in her early 20s standing alone outside a convenience store during heavy rain. Dylan arrived first. Under the flickering gas station lights stood 22-year-old Sophie Ramirez. Her clothes were soaked, her hands shaking as she wrapped them around her chest. Tears rolled down her face while cars splashed water across the empty street beside her. Between sobs, Sophie told Dylan her sister Lily had vanished from their motel room less than an hour earlier. She said strange men had been coming in and out of the motel all week. But when backup officers arrived, nobody seemed interested. One officer shrugged and said, "Teen runaway." Another laughed and muttered, "Probably with a boyfriend." Sergeant Kane looked annoyed before saying, "Not our problem tonight." But Dylan noticed things the others ignored. Dark bruises circled Sophie's wrist. Every time a black SUV drove past the store, she flinched in fear. Then Dylan spotted a motel keycard sticking halfway out of her jacket pocket. Sophie quickly covered it like she was terrified someone would see it. What Sergeant Kane did not realize was that the runaway case he ordered Dylan to ignore was about to uncover corruption tied to some of the most powerful people in the entire city. Rain slammed against Officer Dylan Reed's patrol car as he pulled into the gas station parking lot. Bright neon lights reflected across the wet pavement while thunder rolled through the dark city streets. Near the ice machine outside the store sat Sophie Ramirez, a young woman in her early 20s. Her small body shook from the cold. Water dripped from her hair onto the sidewalk as she cried quietly to herself. The store clerk stood near the entrance with his arms folded. "Officer, she's been out here almost an hour," he explained. "I tried calling somebody, but she just keeps saying her sister is missing." Dylan looked back toward Sophie and immediately felt something was wrong. Most runaway reports did not start with a terrified 22-year-old sitting alone in the rain. Dylan slowly walked over and sat beside her. "Hey," he said softly. "My name's Officer Reed. You okay?" Sophie looked up with red swollen eyes but did not answer. Dylan removed a blanket from the back seat of his patrol car and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. Then he bought her a hot chocolate from inside the gas station and opened the passenger door for her. "You can sit in here where it's warm," he told her. Sophie climbed inside carefully. Dylan radioed dispatch for backup. The dispatcher sounded half asleep. "Copy," she answered lazily before moving to another call. Inside the patrol car, Dylan lowered his voice. "Can you tell me what happened to your sister?" Sophie stared down at the cup in her hands for several seconds before whispering, "They took Lily." Dylan's expression changed immediately. "Who took her?" he asked gently. Sophie explained everything in broken sentences. She said they had been staying at an old motel near the highway. Men came and went from different rooms all night long. Sometimes she heard girls crying through the walls. Earlier that evening, Lily had started arguing with one of the men. Then a black SUV suddenly pulled into the parking lot. Sophie said she saw two men force Lily outside before driving away fast into the rain. Before Dylan could ask another question, bright headlights flashed across the parking lot. Sergeant Kane stepped out of his cruiser already looking irritated. "What is this?" he snapped while rain soaked his uniform. Dylan explained the situation quickly, but Kane barely listened. He glanced toward Sophie sitting inside the patrol car and rolled his eyes. "Why are we babysitting tonight?" he muttered. "It's another runaway report. Clear the scene and move on." But as Dylan looked back at the frightened girl shaking under the blanket, something deep in his gut told him this was far more dangerous than a simple runaway case. Sergeant Kane pulled the patrol car door open and looked directly at Sophie with clear annoyance on his face. "You got a name for the sister?" he asked quickly. Sophie nodded nervously. "Lily Ramirez." Kane sighed loudly and pulled out his notepad. 17. Sophie nodded again. Kane immediately closed the notebook. "Voluntary runaway," he said flatly. "Department policy. Teen probably left with some boyfriend and will come back in 2 days." Dylan frowned. "Sir," she said, "men forced her sister into a black SUV." Kane barely reacted. "And scared girls say all kinds of things," he replied. "There's no probable cause here. No witness besides a frightened girl." Rain continued hitting the roof of the patrol car while Kane stepped closer to Dylan. "You're wasting department resources on a runaway report. Child Services can handle the kid from here." Another patrol officer leaned against his cruiser nearby, shaking his head with a smirk. "Rookie thinks he's in some detective movie," he joked. A few officers laughed quietly. Dylan ignored them and looked back toward Sophie. She sat frozen under the blanket. Her eyes stayed locked on Kane the entire time, almost like she was terrified of him. Kane started giving orders fast. "Stop questioning her," he snapped. "Transfer the child to social services when they arrive. Then clear this scene." Dylan hesitated. "Sir, shouldn't we at least check the motel?" Kane's face hardened immediately. "No. You leave the motel alone. Do you understand me?" Dylan slowly nodded, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. As Kane filled out the report, Dylan noticed several strange things. Kane never wrote down Sophie's full statement. He skipped over the part about the crying girls and the black SUV completely. Even stranger, he never entered the motel name into the system. Dylan glanced toward another officer standing near the cruisers. The officer quietly reached toward his chest and switched off his bodycam without saying a word. Another officer did the same seconds later. A cold feeling ran through Dylan's stomach. Then Sophie suddenly grabbed his sleeve tightly. Her hands trembled badly as she leaned closer to him. "Officer," she whispered softly. Dylan bent down so he could hear her over the rain. Tears filled her eyes again as she looked toward Sergeant Kane standing near the patrol cars. "He knows those men." Dylan froze instantly. For a moment, the sounds of the storm, the flashing police lights, and the voices around him all seemed to disappear. He slowly looked back at Kane laughing with the other officers in the parking lot. And for the first time that night, Dylan realized the danger might not only be outside the department. Long after his shift officially ended, Officer Dylan Reed drove quietly through the rain toward the old motel Sophie described. The building sat near the edge of the highway, hidden behind broken fences and dead streetlights. Half the motel sign no longer worked, leaving only flickering red letters glowing in the darkness. Dylan parked across the street and stared at the building for several seconds. Something about the place felt wrong immediately. He walked carefully toward room 214, the same number written on Sophie's motel keycard. The door was slightly open. Dylan slowly pushed it wider and stepped inside. The room looked abandoned in a hurry. A chair lay flipped over beside the bed. Women's clothes were scattered across the floor. In the bathroom, dark blood stains marked the cracked tile near the sink. Dylan's breathing slowed as he scanned the room carefully with his flashlight. Then he spotted something small beneath the bed. A silver child's necklace. Dylan bent down and picked it up carefully. Pink letters across the charm spelled out the name Lily. His stomach tightened instantly. Near the ceiling, wires hung loose where security cameras had clearly been ripped out. Whoever left this motel wanted no evidence behind. Dylan immediately grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reed. I need backup at the Highway Star Motel right now," he said urgently. "Possible kidnapping scene. Possible human trafficking activity." There was silence for several seconds before dispatch finally answered weakly, "Copy that." But instead of backup officers rushing to help, 3 supervisor vehicles suddenly pulled into the motel parking lot. Sergeant Kane jumped out first, slamming his cruiser door hard. "What the hell are you doing here?" he shouted while marching toward Dylan. Rain poured down his face as other officers watched nervously from nearby patrol cars. Dylan held up the necklace carefully. "Sir, this place is connected to Lily Ramirez. There's blood inside the room." Kane barely even looked at it. "You disobeyed a direct order." Kane screamed. "You trying to embarrass this department?" His voice echoed across the empty motel parking lot. Other officers stood silently under the flashing lights, avoiding eye contact. Kane stepped closer and pointed directly at Dylan's chest. "Hand over your cruiser keys. You're done with active patrol until further notice." Dylan slowly removed the keys from his belt. "You're lucky I don't suspend you tonight," Kane snapped. Then his eyes moved toward Dylan's flashing bodycam. "Turn that camera off. Right now." The rain hammered against the pavement as the entire parking lot went silent. Dylan looked around at the watching officers. Then back at Kane. And quietly said, "No, sir." For a second, Kane looked completely stunned. But before he could explode again, 2 detectives near the back of the motel suddenly called out loudly. "Sergeant, you need to see this." Fresh tire tracks cut through the mud behind the building. And beside them sat a heavy locked basement door. The detectives forced the basement door open with a metal tool while officers crowded behind them in silence. A horrible smell drifted out from the darkness below. Dylan grabbed his flashlight and followed carefully down the narrow concrete stairs. The deeper they went, the quieter everyone became. Then the light from the flashlights revealed something none of them expected. Several young girls sat terrified inside the basement room. Some were wrapped in dirty blankets. Others looked weak and badly bruised. One girl immediately started crying when she saw the officers. Cameras had been hidden in corners around the room. Tables nearby were covered with drugs, stacks of cash, fake identification cards, and notebooks filled with names and phone numbers. Dylan felt sick as he looked around. This was far bigger than a missing runaway case. One rescued girl pointed toward the papers on the table with shaking hands. "Rich men come here," she whispered. "Important people." Detectives quickly opened the notebooks and froze. Several names belonged to wealthy businessmen, city officials, and people connected to local government offices. The entire basement suddenly exploded into chaos. Officers started shouting for medical teams while detectives secured evidence as fast as possible. Then black federal vehicles suddenly rushed into the motel parking lot outside. FBI agents poured through the building entrance while local officers stepped aside in confusion. Sergeant Kane's face lost all color the moment he saw them. "Nobody talks to media," he yelled immediately. "Nobody uploads bodycam footage. Nobody says a word without department approval." His voice shook badly now. Other supervisors looked just as panicked. But it was already too late. Dylan's body cam had captured everything from the beginning. Sophie's warnings. Kane dismissing the case as a runaway. The orders to ignore the motel. The threats against Dylan for investigating further. The delayed response after evidence had already been found. Several officers quietly realized the cameras around them had recorded every second of it. Outside the motel, flashing ambulance lights filled the rainy parking lot. Sophie stood wrapped in a blanket beside Dylan's patrol car when paramedics suddenly carried a weak teenage girl through the motel doors. The moment Sophie saw her face, she screamed. "Lily!" The girl looked exhausted and pale, but alive. Sophie ran across the parking lot crying as Lily collapsed into her arms. The sisters held each other tightly while paramedics and officers watched in silence. Dylan stood nearby, breathing heavily as his body cam captured the emotional reunion under the flashing police lights. Above them, loud helicopter blades suddenly thundered through the stormy sky. News helicopters had arrived. And in that exact moment, everything changed. Federal agents filled the motel parking lot as rain kept falling hard on the flashing lights. Supervisors from the local department stood in a tight group, looking nervous and confused. Sergeant Kane tried to step forward quickly, fixing his uniform as if he could still control the situation. "We led the operation," he said loudly. "We found the location and secured the scene." A senior FBI agent turned slowly toward him. His face stayed calm, but his voice was firm. "No," he said. "You did not." Kane blinked, surprised. The agent pointed toward Dylan standing near the patrol car, still wearing his wet uniform and body cam. "This rescue happened because your rookie officer ignored your orders and followed the truth instead." The words hit the scene like a shockwave. Kane's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Other supervisors looked down at the ground, avoiding eye contact. One by one, officers started stepping back, no longer willing to stand behind him. The FBI agent continued speaking, making it clear that every decision from the department had already been recorded and reviewed on scene. Then something unexpected happened. One officer slowly raised his hand and spoke in a quiet voice. "Sir, we've been burying missing girl cases for years." The parking lot went completely silent. Even Kane turned sharply toward him. The officer looked ashamed but continued. "If they were teens, we were told to call them runaways and move on. Cameras from news crews captured everything." Kane's earlier shouting echoed through footage being recorded in real time. Dylan standing calmly beside Sophie. Sophie still shaking but safe after everything she had been through. The rescued girls being helped into ambulances while crying and holding each other tightly. Every moment was broadcast live as helicopters circled above. By morning, the story had already exploded across the city. People online shared clips of Kane screaming at Dylan. Others shared the moment Dylan refused to turn off his body cam. Many focused on Sophie's warning and how it was ignored. The rescue was being called one of the biggest corruption exposures the city had ever seen. Hashtags with Dylan's name started trending as citizens praised him for saving lives when no one else would listen. Inside police headquarters, leadership teams rushed into emergency meetings. Phones rang non-stop. Lawyers, supervisors, and city officials argued behind closed doors about damage control. But the footage was already out, and nothing could stop what people had seen. And in the middle of it all, one rookie officer stood quietly in the rain, knowing the truth was finally out in the open. Kane sits in the interview room, sweating as cameras record everything. He tries to stay calm, but his voice keeps breaking. He says it was all a misunderstanding. He says things got mixed up in the field. He even tries to say Dylan acted alone without control. But the investigators do not react. They just keep watching him closely. Kane then changes his story again. He says Dylan disobeyed a direct order and made everything worse. He points at the bodycam footage and claims it does not show the full situation. He tries to sound confident, but his hands are shaking under the table. Every answer he gives makes him look more guilty. Outside the room, federal agents continue going through files. They find reports that were changed after they were written. Some missing girl cases were marked as runaway without any checks. Others were closed in less than 1 hour, even when evidence was listed. It becomes clear this was not a mistake. It was a system. One investigator holds up a list of names and says several of these girls were reported more than once. None were ever properly investigated. Some officers begin to speak quietly, admitting they were told to leave certain files alone. The room starts to feel heavier as the truth builds. Kane hears this through the open door and starts to panic. He stands up too fast and knocks his chair back. He says he was protecting the department from public chaos. But no one believes him anymore. Investigators now have recordings, files, and witness statements all pointing in one direction. A senior detective finally speaks clearly and says they are building a criminal case against internal leadership. Kane goes silent for a moment. For the first time, he realizes this is no longer just about one missing girl or one rookie officer. It is much bigger than he ever expected, and there is nowhere left for him to hide. The situation did not stay inside the station for long. Once the bodycam footage was released, everything exploded online. People across the city, and even other countries, started watching the same clips again and again. They could not believe what they were seeing. A rookie officer trying to help a crying child. A supervisor shouting instead of listening. And a system that ignored danger until it was too late. Millions of viewers focused on one moment. Dylan kneeling beside Sophie, speaking to her softly while she shook from fear. Then another moment, Kane yelling at him in front of other officers, treating the missing girl report like it meant nothing. And then the most shocking part, officers laughing and calling it a runaway case while a real child was clearly in danger. The public reaction grew stronger every hour. People became angry, not just at Kane, but at the entire department. Families of missing teenagers started coming forward, saying they had been ignored for months or even years. Some said they were told the same thing again and again, that their daughters were probably runaways and not worth serious investigation. Inside the department, internal affairs began pulling old records. What they found made the situation worse. There were reports that had been closed without any investigation. Names of missing girls were marked as resolved with no proof. Some officers were even recorded warning others not to dig too deep into certain cases. Soon, federal agents stepped in fully. Raids began across multiple offices and linked locations in the city. High-ranking officers were arrested one by one as evidence piled up. Files, emails, and hidden recordings all pointed to a long pattern of corruption and silence. It was no longer just one case. It was an entire system being exposed. As the news spread, headlines changed the story completely. Dylan's name started appearing everywhere. News stations called him the rookie who exposed the department. People online praised him for doing what others refused to do. And as the investigation widened, it became clear that one decision to follow a scared child's words had uncovered a truth no one in power could hide anymore. The fallout came fast and hard. Sergeant Kane's career ended in full view of the public. He was fired without ceremony, arrested shortly after for obstruction, and later linked to deeper corruption investigations. His name was removed from leadership records, and his pension was completely taken away. The same authority he once used to silence others disappeared overnight. Other officers were not spared either. Several were suspended as internal affairs expanded the case. Some were formally indicted for covering up reports and ignoring serious complaints. A few quietly resigned before charges could be filed. The department, once proud of its image, was now under full federal control and strict outside monitoring. As the investigation closed in on the trafficking network, more victims were rescued. The operation was fully dismantled, revealing how long it had been running under protection. Missing girls were finally located and reunited with their families. The emotional scenes were heavy, with parents breaking down as they held their children again after years of pain and unanswered questions. Back at the department, everything changed. Dylan was called to a public city meeting where officials stood before a packed hall. He received a medal for bravery, along with a formal apology from leadership. A promotion offer was also placed on the table, recognizing the risk he took by refusing to follow unlawful orders. The crowd stood and applauded him for several long moments. The most emotional moment came at the ceremony itself. Sophie ran forward and hugged Dylan tightly, holding on like she never wanted to let go again. Her sister Lily stood beside them, crying quietly as she watched. It was a moment that showed everything that had been lost, and everything that had finally been saved. The police chief then stepped forward and spoke clearly. He said that one honest rookie had succeeded where an entire department had failed. His words stayed in the room as silence followed. Later, the narrator closed the story by reminding everyone that Dylan was once punished for doing the right thing, but his courage exposed corruption that had been hiding in plain sight. And then the final question was asked: would you risk your own badge to protect someone nobody else believed?